Welcome back to the Broadman Word, and we are actually going to be wrapping up the life of Joseph, at least when it comes to the book of Genesis. There's one other place that I do want to look at after this, but when it comes to the life of Joseph in Genesis today, it's going to be the end of the line when it comes to that. So turn with me to Genesis chapter 50. We're going to look at the whole entire chapter here today. So verse 1. Then Joseph fell on his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. And Joseph commanded his servants, the physicians, to embalm his father. So the physicians embalmed Israel. 40 days were required for it, for that is how many are required for embalming. And the Egyptians wept for him 70 days. So Jacob has passed. And clearly, this has a huge impact on Joseph. And but the amount of time that is given to Jacob to remember him, to celebrate his life, to grieve his passing, is quite astounding. I mean, we are it's basically a 70-day funeral, which is kind of crazy to think about. I mean, that is you think 60 days, 2 months, so that's almost 2.5 months worth of funeral basically proceedings. And so but in this day and age that would have been extremely common. Maybe not this long, as it said. It did take them 40 days for embalming, so maybe it doesn't take 70 days to mourn. But because of the impact that Joseph has had on the country of Egypt, that's how long the grieving process was. And I think it's interesting too that at the end of verse 3 there it says, and the Egyptians wept for Jacob. It wasn't just Joseph and his brothers and their children and their families, but it was the Egyptians. And I think that speaks just volumes to the character of Joseph that we have been seeing just kind of growing over the study of the life of Joseph. And so it really makes a lot of sense why this impact is so far reaching. And not only that, but then it gets to Pharaoh as well, of course. Verse 4. And when the days of weaving for him were past, so 70 days, Joseph spoke to the household of Pharaoh, saying, if now I have found favor in your eyes, please speak in the ears of Pharaoh, saying, my father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. In my tomb that I hewed out for myself in the land of Canaan, there shall you bury me. Now therefore let me please go up and bury my father, then I will return. And Pharaoh answered, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. So Joseph went up to bury his father. With him went all the servants of Pharaoh, the elders of his household, and all the elders of the land of Egypt, as well as all the household of Joseph, his brothers, and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the land of Goshen. And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen. It was a very great company. So you have not just the respect for Jacob, obviously within his own family, but with the Egyptians as well, all the way up to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh gives basically kind of like a leave of absence, but in a good way. So it's kind of like a bereavement kind of thing, maybe, if I remember. I think that's the right word, but it's basically just this time where Pharaoh's like, yeah, go and go and think about the impact that your father has made on your life. Continue to grieve for him and put him to rest in a dignified manner, in a respectful manner. Obviously, with the embalming practices that the Egyptians had, the afterlife was extremely important. Now, granted, they didn't have it correct, right? They weren't following in the steps of Yahweh, but they saw the importance of the afterlife, and a big part of that is legacy that somebody leaves behind as they go into death. And so that to me is why Pharaoh is so ready and so helpful with us, and obviously again because of the character of Joseph as well that comes forward very clearly. So, verse 10, when they came to the threshing floor of Atad, which is beyond the Jordan, they lamented there with a very great and grievous lamentation. And he made a mourning for his father 7 days. So, another week of mourning once they get to the area. When the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, saw the mourning on the threshing floor of Atad, they said, "This is a grievous mourning by the Egyptians." Therefore, the place was named Abel Mizraim. It is beyond the Jordan River. And so, again, I mean, this is probably both interesting, grabs their attention, but also probably a little bit nerve wracking that, if not the greatest superpower at that time, being Egypt, is making all of this lamentation noise. Abel Mizraim, by the way, means mourning of Egypt, or the meadow of Egypt. So it just continues this idea of the mourning for Jacob. Verse 12, thus his sons did for him as he had commanded them. For his sons carried him to the land of Canaan and buried him in the cave of the field at Machpelah to the east of Mamre, which Abraham bought with a field from Ephron the Hittite to possess as a burying place. After he had buried his father, Joseph returned to Egypt with his brothers and all who had gone up with him to bury his father. So he buries his father in a very respectful manner, and he does so reuniting him with his grandfather and Joseph's great grandfather, which is Abraham. But then it's interesting how the brothers respond to the death of their father, to the death of Jacob. Let's look at that. Verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So before we see how Joseph responds to that, again, a lot of the time with Joseph's brothers, we're like, oh, they're clueless, they have no clue, and they're also just awful people for doing what they did to Joseph, which I get. Don't get me wrong, I get that. But I think here it makes a lot of sense. It really does. Because you have their father, and he is such a respected figure by Joseph, and he's so loved by Joseph as well, and obviously he loves Joseph too. But when he dies, you might be thinking, well, what's the obstacle now? I mean, Joseph really could do whatever he kind of wants at this point, because he has the backing of Pharaoh, he has the backing of the Egyptians. He's the one that helped the family to get them to Goshen and away from Canaan so that they would survive these 7 years of famine. There's a lot going for Joseph, to the point where if he wanted to, it could be all over, which is obviously a frightening moment for the brothers. Now, granted, we should be able to say, well, haven't they learned anything? That Joseph clearly is forgiving them. Yes. I mean, they should be able to see that. But again, it makes sense why they are a little bit nervous about this and a little bit frightened as well. So they go to Joseph about this. So I think that's the growth here. Instead of talking behind his back and coming with like an escape plan or something like that where they flee from Egypt, they go right to Joseph and decide to talk to him about it instead, which they did not do before. So I think there is still growth there, even though they are still very much in a fearful mindset. So verse 16. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died. Say to Joseph, please forget the transgression of your brothers and their sin, because they did evil to you. And now please forget the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." Joseph wept when they spoke to him. His brothers also came and fell down before him and said, "Behold, we are your servants." And we'll see what Joseph's response is to this, not just this plea, but the action of bowing down as well. So you have this command from Jacob from beyond the grave that that Joseph is not to repay evil to his brothers. Now, is it possible that they made this up, and Jacob never actually said this? Possibly, but I think it genuinely was a statement made by Jacob to one, if not all, the other brothers when Joseph just wasn't present. So I think that is definitely possible. I don't see what they would really, why they would lie to Joseph about this. But especially meant knowing what they then do action wise, that they then bow down to him, fall down before him, is what it really says in verse 18. I think that is showing that they genuinely, this is a genuine plea. This is a genuine command given by their father before he died to Joseph. And Joseph could say, "Look, I get what Dad is saying, but you guys did a pretty bad things to me in the past, so I'm not gonna heed that." No, but instead, he talks about it in such a great and godly way here. Verse 19. But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for I am in the place." But Joseph said, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today. So do not fear, I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. This is such a great statement. One, you have the commands of "do not fear." Then you have it repeated in verse 21, "So do not fear." But you also have this great question, for am I in the place of God? And for us as believers, it's important to see that, don't get me wrong, there are times where we are to help discipline each other as we walk and try to strive to be more and more like Jesus. But at the end of the day, we cannot be the judge, jury, and executioner. We can't be, because we are not in the place of God. Yes, there's a point where discipline comes about in a brotherly, sisterly way towards each other as brothers and sisters in Christ, but we are not in the place of God. And I think that's what Joseph ultimately is saying here. Look, I'm not in the place of God to bring judgment upon you, even though you may deserve it. And verse 20 definitely shows that. As for you, you meant evil against me. But then here's the great part, but God meant it for good, to bring about that many people should be kept alive. And I think it's also precious as well to see that he throws in, not that he just cares about them as individuals, but he cares about their families. He cares about their legacy. And again, we've talked about how important legacy is in the book of Genesis. At the end of, in the middle of verse 21 there, "I will provide for you and your little ones." I think that is such a powerful statement that we don't really think too much about. But then what's interesting is after that, it just kind of quickens and ends for Joseph. Verse 22. So Joseph remained in Egypt, he and his father's house. Joseph lived 110 years. And Joseph saw Ephraim's children of the third generation. The children also of Machir, the son of Manasseh, were counted as Joseph's own. And Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die. But God will visit you and bring you up out of this land, to the land that he swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Then Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, saying, God will surely visit you, and you shall carry up my bones from here. So Joseph died, being 110 years old. They embalmed him, and he was put in a coffin in Egypt. So I think there's a couple things here. I think it's interesting that they mentioned that he's 110 years old twice here. I think that's incredibly interesting. And just for me, it goes to show the growth in character for Joseph was one of the reasons why he lived 110 years. I think there is a connection there for sure. The other thing that's interesting here as well is yes, he gets to see his legacy live out in verse 23, but you also see that some of, if not, it just says his brothers in verse 24 and verse 25. So we're not entirely sure if all of the 11 brothers are alive at this point, or is it just a majority of them? But it's interesting that his brothers are still alive when he dies. And I find that very, very interesting because you would think that in order to in our mindset, it would seem more fair that Joseph would outlive his brothers who were so wrong to him. But instead, they actually outlived Joseph. But again, I think it is what a testimony to Joseph that he could have gotten upset, like, why am I dying before they do? But instead, he goes out peacefully and he goes out with such a in such a godly manner. And he really does kind of foreshadow the exodus of Egypt when he says in verse 25 that they will carry up his bones from here to Canaan. It seems obvious, I think, at that point that the Egyptians would want to keep the body of Joseph because of how instrumental he has been in their recent history at that point. So they would most likely want to keep his body, but yet at some point they will go and have his body be put into Canaan, into the promised land. And I think that is a foreshadowing to the Exodus, that not only is the body of Joseph going, but the family of Joseph will be going with him back to the promised land, which is where we will turn, actually on Thursday, we will turn to our last time looking at the life of Joseph. We will turn to the point where his bones are brought back to the promised land. So thanks for spending time with me as we wrap up the Genesis part of the life of Joseph, and I will see you on Thursday. Thanks.